The widow of a man Gary Gilmore allegedly killed is seeking over $1 million from the condemned inmate. Today, her lawyers tried to question Gilmore at the state prison, and Bill Brown was there.
Gilmour was convicted of killing Benny Bushnell of Provo. He was charged in a second murder, that of Max David Jensen in Orem, but he's never been tried in that crime. Jensen's widow, Colleen, is suing Gilmour in behalf of herself and her 10-month-old child. She wants $1 million in general damages and $50,000 in punitive damages for what her lawyers called the wrongful death of her husband. Gilmour's also being sued for $2 million by the Bushnell family and for about $45,000 by the insurance firm that must pay workman's compensation to Mrs. Jensen. Today, Colleen Jensen's lawyers went to the prison to take a deposition from Gilmour. Joined by the convict's attorneys, they all went to a face-to-face visit with him in maximum security. A judge forbade all of them to answer reporters' questions about what was said.
We talk to you?
I'm afraid we can't make any comment.
Should we ask anyway?
No, there's no sense because there'd be no answer.
Okay. What went on in there?
I have no comment on what actually happened inside.
Did Gilmour talk when he was asked questions?
I can't comment even on that. I think it's better that these matters be handled, in the courtroom, and probably no disclosure would be appropriate. I can't answer.
As his lawyer, what do you think about all these lawsuits? People trying to get millions of dollars from a man who's just about to be executed.
Anybody can file a lawsuit.
There was speculation today that Gilmour refused to even come out of his cell and meet with Mrs. Jensen's lawyers, but another rumor said he did answer their questions. There's been some talk that if Gilmour didn't answer the questions, he could be held in contempt and held in the county jail, and that might further delay his execution. But that is just speculation.
From books and movies about him, Gilmour is said to be getting paid something under $1 million. The families of his victims and the other people suing him are seeking over $3 million. If they expect to get anything, they'll have to move fast, because if Utah law is followed, in 12 more days out here, Gilmour will be shot. Bill Brown, Newswatch 2, the Utah State Prison.
The Salt Lake Tribune and KUTV are fighting for the right of the press to cover Gilmour's execution. Today, lawyers for the newspaper and television station filed action in federal district court in Salt Lake City. They're asking that a 3-judge federal panel meet and issue a restraining order allowing reporters and photographers to cover the execution. The execution set for January 17th. A federal judge in Texas ruled that the press has a constitutional right to witness executions, to take pictures, and to broadcast them to the public. Now, technically, Utah law bans the press from executions, but in the past, reporters have been free to attend. However, Warden Sam Smith says that's over, that Gary Gilmour will be shot at a secret spot, out of sight of all news people. The complaint filed by the Tribune and Channel 2 claims that it is unconstitutional, that it violates the First and 14th Amendments. If the death penalty is to be a deterrent, the complaint says it must be covered by the press and exposed to the public. Tribune publisher John Gallivan said, "Our action is consistent with a pervasive duty of the press to protect the public's right to know. The press has no right to stand idle amid any erosion of everyone's First Amendment." The general manager of KUTV, Bob Temple, said, "The public has a right to be informed as to such events, and the press has not only the right, but the duty to report events relating to the execution in order to implement the public's right to know." Temple said KUTV does not wish to glorify the event or sensationalize it. Coverage by the press constitutes the means whereby the public learns about and evaluates the desirability of capital punishment. KUTV has no plans to televise the execution. As to the pictures taken by the cameraman, no decision has been made on what might be used on the air. A Texas judge has ruled a local television station can televise executions. Here's a report.
Last month, Texas prison authorities barred reporters from death row at Huntsville, where 52 men are awaiting execution. But in response to a newsman's suit, a federal judge overturned that ruling. This morning, reporters and photographers were permitted back on death row to interview inmates. The judge's ruling went beyond that. He said a television camera could be present at future executions to record pictures of men dying in the electric chair. The next man scheduled to die is Jerry Lane Jurek, convicted of killing a 10-year-old girl. His execution is set for 2 weeks from today. And what does Jurek think of the idea of televised executions?
I think it's fantastic.
You think it's fantastic. Why?
They stop the whole death penalty.
You think people will be repelled by seeing a man die?
I believe they will. See what that case to do to a person, because it ain't very nice.
Some reporters think it's wrong to permit cameras at executions. One is local newspaperman Don Reed, who's seen 189 men die in the electric chair.
I think by televising it or filming it, it becomes a three-ring circus. There's enough people with morbid curiosity that if you sold tickets, they'd buy a ticket to witness it.
Prison officials say it serves no useful purpose to have televised executions. But they say unless the state attorney general successfully appeals the court ruling, they have no choice. Cameras must be admitted when the first man dies. George Lewis, NBC News, Huntsville, Texas.
A number of attorneys are still trying to stop Gary Gilmore's execution. They're planning to explore a legal test of the constitutionality of Utah's death penalty. The final plans will be discussed next Monday. Meanwhile, Judge Marcellus Snow said that Gilmore's refusal to answer questions in a civil lawsuit would not delay the execution, but it could mean the plaintiffs might win by default. Gilmore is being sued by 2 insurance companies and the widows of the 2 men he was charged with killing. A new effort will be made to spare the life of Gary Gilmore. Gilmore is set to face the firing squad next Monday, but today a Salt Lake lawyer said he'll try to block that execution. Details from Bill Brown.
Besides Gary Gilmore, there are 7 men on Utah's death row, and the appeal will be filed in behalf of 2 of them. Salt Lake City Attorney Gilbert Athey, who just ran for Utah Attorney General and lost, is bringing the action with his associates, Robert Van Sciver and Randy Gaither. The 3 lawyers represent one of the 2 men convicted in Ogden's well-known hi-fi shop murders, Dale Pierre. Pierre and another U.S. Air Force airman, William Andrews, killed 3 people in Ogden and wounded 2 others. Both were sentenced to die. They also represent Irving Dunston, the man on the far right. Dunston and 2 others, Gypsy Codiana and Craig Marvel, belong to a motorcycle gang. In Price, Utah, they killed a man in execution style and were all convicted and given the death penalty. Athey says next Wednesday or Thursday, he and his partners will file an appeal in federal district court here in Salt Lake City. They'll ask that Gilmore's execution be stayed until their case can be heard. That suit will claim that if Gilmore is shot, it will deny Pierre and Dunston their civil rights. In fact, could lead to their executions. Another claim could be that Utah's capital punishment law is unconstitutional because it lacks an automatic review of the death penalty. The Utah affiliate of the American Civil Liberties Union won't make any appeals for Gilmore, at least not now. Today, after a 2-hour meeting, the local ACLU president, Michael Rudick, said they had agreed to take no action for a few days. Rudick said if other appeals come forth, the ACLU will join those as friends of the court. Rudick said he fears Gilmore could be killed, and then the Utah law ruled unconstitutional.
We feel confident that if appellate review of Utah's death penalty statute comes about, we feel confident that it will be declared unconstitutional. And therefore, we are very much concerned that appellate review of this take place. We're concerned that if the execution of Gary Gilmore were to take place, and appellate review were to happen later on, and if, as we expect, the death penalty statute in Utah were to be declared unconstitutional, then the state of Utah can be considered rather negligent in the matter. This is one reason why it's extremely important that that execution not go off as planned on Monday before an appellate review has taken place.
Rudick believes the odds are in their favor.
Yes.
He feels they can still stop the execution.
I think it'd be hard to predict how they would
As of
rule.
now, Gary Gilmore has just over 6 days left to live. Bill Brown, Newswatch 2, Salt Lake City.
A Utah State prison psychiatrist has termed killer Gary Gilmore more emotionally and mentally stable than he has been for a long time. Dr. Van Osten spent a half hour this morning with Gilmour. The psychiatrist says Gilmore is in good spirits. The convict is scheduled to get his desired execution 1 week from today. During the weekend, Gilmour waged a verbal battle with the American Civil Liberties Union over the issue of his execution. Gilmour's stand is unchanged. He wants to face the firing squad next Monday. U.S. District Court Judge Alden Anderson is still hearing testimony about whether newsmen should be allowed to witness the execution of Gary Gilmore. The deputy warden of the Utah State Prison says plans will be finalized tomorrow for the execution of the prisoner. Leon Hatch says a few things will have to be done before Gilmore faces the firing squad Monday. Meantime, Gilmore awaits patiently in his maximum security cell, and Barbara Grossman has a report.
Prison officials have decided to relax some restrictions on Gilmore since he has less than 5 days to live. He should remain in isolation because of bad behavior, but Deputy Warden Hatch says those restrictions will be lifted tomorrow. In the meantime, Gilmore has been allowed to visit with his 2 brothers and attorneys.
What's his attitude? It's very positive. In fact, he was a little bit upset because some of the news media have been quoting somebody saying he was becoming more nervous, and he said, "I'm the same today as I was when the date was set. It was a day that I've always been the same, haven't changed. I'm not nervous, and I'm cool as a cucumber."
Through his lawyer, Gilmore today released another letter to the public. In it, he thanked the thousands of people who have sent him letters. He said, "I appreciate the care, consideration, concern, and love reflected in the letters." Gilmore apologized for not answering all of them, but said, "I'm limited in time." He ended it by thanking what he called the rural bumpkin in Georgia who mailed him a rope. Said Gilmore, "As you know, it was returned unused. Prison regulations forbid ropes." But, said the convicted killer, "I appreciate your concern." Gary Gilmore is still asking to talk to his girlfriend Nicole before he dies on Monday. She was committed to the Utah State Hospital after her suicide attempt. But Stanger says he can't get any response from hospital officials. Stanger says as all Gilmore wants to tell her is to lead a good life. Barbara Grossman, Newswatch 2, State Prison.
As we said, testimony is still being presented before Judge Alden Anderson over the question of whether newsmen should be allowed to witness Gilmore's execution. The suit was filed by KUTV and the Salt Lake Tribune. They contend there is an absolute need for the media to be represented at the Monday morning hearing, the Monday morning execution, that is. But the University of Utah psychologist Dr. Victor Klein today testified that young people would attempt to imitate the execution if it were televised. However, KUTV Vice President and General Manager Robert Temple today said that KUTV would, under no circumstances, broadcast the actual execution. However, he did say the public is entitled to view the scene before and after the event. Sandy Gilmour is at the courthouse, and he'll have a live report later in this newscast. More wrangling in the Gilmore case, the Salt Lake attorney Judith Walbach has petitioned the Attorney General's office to stay the execution. Walbach says she is working with noted trial lawyer Melvin Belli, who says the state could be liable for a $2.5 million lawsuit if that execution occurs. Walbach says the execution would violate the U.S. Constitution. Utah Attorney General Robert HANSEN says he has no intention of staying the execution. He says his office has no power to do so, and he says it would be contrary to previous stands taken by the Attorney General's office. Good evening. The people trying to stop the killing of Gary Gilmore are running out of chances. Today they went to federal court, a state district court, and the governor of Utah. And everywhere they lost. Bill Brown reports.
3 Utah defense attorneys went to federal district court here in Salt Lake City trying to get a new stay of execution. Lawyers Gilbert Athey and Randall Gaither and a third attorney, Robert Van Sciver, not shown here, represent 2 other inmates condemned to die by Utah firing squad. One of them, Dale Pierre, was convicted in the Ogden hi-fi shop murders back in 1974. The other man is Irvin Dunstan, found guilty of a slaying in Price, Utah in 1975. Both are under stays of execution until the Utah Supreme Court hears their appeals. Today, Athey told federal Judge Alden Anderson if Gilmore is shot, it will deny Pierre and Dunstan their civil rights. Athey said no one should be executed until the Utah Supreme Court has reviewed the constitutionality of Utah's death law. If Gilmore is killed, Athey said, appellate courts would then be reluctant to judge the law unconstitutional, and that could hurt Pierre and Dunstan. For the state, Assistant Attorney General Earl Doria said killing Gilmore won't affect appeals by the 2 other inmates. He said they could still go to the Utah Supreme Court and get a fair hearing. Doria said the public and the court system won't stand for another delay in the Gilmore execution. Judge Anderson denied the appeal, saying Athey simply had not proved that killing Gilmore would harm the other 2 men. Utah Attorney General Robert HANSEN was pleased. Did you expect such a last-minute flurry of appeals to stop Gilmour's execution?
Yes, I expected that there would be these last-minute efforts, and that was for that reason that we were prepared already to go to Denver on our own behalf if that were necessary.
Do you think you'll prevail and be able to, in fact, execute the man?
Well, that goes back to the same question I couldn't answer before because of the fact that it might be construed as some effort to influence how the court would decide that.
You must be pleased with this decision, though. It's in your favor.
Well, every time you get a decision that's in your favor, of course, that's what you want. That's what you're in court fighting for.
At the end, his associates are planning to appeal the ruling tomorrow to the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals in Denver. They may argue in person before a 3-judge federal panel or simply send their documents. If they lose there, they plan one last legal shot.
Sounds like that when you call in, too.
One of the lawyers said,
you really think
so, Dad? There's going to be an execution.
Sorry, Jim. I tried to leave a message. The thing is, I need you to do a piece of work for me.
Had some audio problems in that story, obviously. Those opposed to Gilmour's execution also failed to get a stay from the 3rd District Court, 3rd District State Court, and from the governor. But the opponents went ahead with plans for a mass meeting tomorrow and for a death watch vigil on execution morning. Sandy Gilmour reports on these developments.
The State District Court in Salt Lake heard a request for a restraining order against the execution. Attorney Judy Wolbach represented a few Utah taxpayers. She contended the Utah death law is unconstitutional and that money spent on the execution would be money wrongfully spent. The Civil Liberties Union joined in. Jinx Dabney argued the law is bad because it does not require mandatory appeal to the state Supreme Court. 2 attorneys for the Attorney General's office called all this a ruse to delay the execution. Judge Dean Condor ruled immediately. He threw out the request for a stay of execution, saying the law had to be presumed constitutional and the execution expenses legal. Ms. Wolbach, the lawyer, wept and called it heartbreaking. Shortly after court, 5:30 p.m., she and Attorney Jinx Dabney asked Governor Matheson for a stay of execution. Said Matheson, no dice.
There's no change in circumstances, and since the governor has already acted, I have no jurisdiction to take any further action as the governor of the state.
Earlier today, one of the country's most active death penalty opponents arrived in Salt Lake.
We believe that the killing of a human being by the state of Utah is made no less atrocious by the victim's consent. Gilmour's execution would be the first step in a veritable bloodbath of executions around the country. That is not worthy of a civilized society, in our judgment.
At a news conference in the Capitol, other opponents issued statements.
The death penalty is a barbaric institution that belongs in the Dark Ages. It has been unequally used against poor people, blacks, Chicanos, and other minority peoples.
We must mix our trigger-happy fingers in his blood. If we accept our role as judges and executioners, what is it that divorces us and instantly distances us from the crimes that he committed?
Plans were announced for an anti-capital punishment mass meeting tomorrow at 2 p.m., office building behind the Capitol. And there will be what a spokesman called a peaceful vigil the morning of the execution. And the execution still on schedule more than ever. Sandy Gilmour, Newswatch 2.
Well, the man who said Utahns don't want executions was proved wrong today. Gary Gilmore was shot to death by a firing squad, and Bill Brown reports from the prison.
They said he had a death wish, but Gary Gilmore didn't. He explained that if forced to choose between years in prison and swift execution, he would take death. Today, Utah gave him his choice. At 5 minutes after 8 o'clock in the morning, 5 civilian riflemen, none of them law officers, shot the murderer through the heart. Gilmour became the first criminal executed in this country in almost 10 years. A last-minute stay of execution was overturned, and it went off a little later than scheduled. Gilmour was taken to a cinder block warehouse. He wanted to stand and see it, but they strapped him to a chair. Over 24 witnesses and relatives were there. The firing squad was never seen. Hidden inside a canvas tent, they fired through narrow slits. When it was time, the warden asked Gary Gilmore if he had any final words. Gilmour said, "Let's do it." At that point, 2 guards placed a hood over his head, and then the warden gave the signal. The bullets pierced the white target pinned over his heart on his black T-shirt, spattering blood around the chair. The doctor says the man's body functions lasted 2 more minutes, but he doesn't know if he felt any pain.
He always said constantly that he looked forward to the time when he could have quiet, when he could meditate. And today, Gary Gilmore has quiet. He has quiet through eternity.
Gary Gilmore brutally murdered 2 young men, and now he's paid the full price demanded by society. But the controversy over capital punishment that he began will not end with his death. Bill Brown, Newswatch 2, the Utah State Prison.
Legal battles, which lasted from 10 p.m. last night till 8 o'clock this morning, threatened to postpone that execution. At 1 a.m., U.S. Federal Judge Willis Ritter called it off, and that caused dozens of lawyers to fight all night. State lawyers rushed by airplane to get to the Court of Appeals in Denver to overturn Ritter's order. That plane even had a judge and the lawyer against the execution, Judy Walbuck. Sandy Gilmour went to Denver for this report.
It was 6:20 a.m. After a 2-hour flight, the state's official airplane arrived from Salt Lake. Aboard, 10th Circuit Court Judge David Lewis, who lives in Salt Lake, Utah Attorney General Robert HANSEN, 4 assistants. They were in a rush, it appeared, to get the execution back on schedule.
Judge Lewis, it's rather extraordinary for you to make this trip. Why are you doing it?
Because of the time element.
6:45 a.m., appeals court in session. The judges made it clear they were in a hurry. The Attorney General argued Judge Ritter had no right to issue his writ. Judy Walbuck claimed tax money was wrongfully spent on an unconstitutional execution. She and local Denver lawyers were abruptly, snappishly cut off by judges. All the lawyers were told, get on with it, time is running out. At 7:29, the 3 judges recessed, came back 6 minutes later. They said Gary Gilmore had not appealed and no one else belonged in court. At 7:36, Judges Breitenstein, McWilliams, and Lewis all ordered the execution to resume, 3 minutes before the scheduled execution of 7:39. Assistant Attorney General Earl Dorius made a coded call to the prison. Go ahead with the execution. Word came back to Denver at 8:08 a.m. I told Attorney General Robert HANSEN.
It apparently has just come over the AP wire that Gary Gilmore has been executed and that he is dead. And the time now is 10 minutes after 8. Comment or reaction?
Well, it's always sad when anyone dies, of course. I don't feel any personal victory, but I think it's important that justice be carried out, and I think it was just that he suffer the sentence of death.
The lawyer who lost had also been up all night. The life Judy Walbuck sought to save was now gone.
I just overheard that he was executed at 8:05 this morning. Is that correct? I'm just appalled that it happened, Sandy. I can't believe it.
We arrived here at this federal appeals courthouse in Denver at 15 minutes before 7. Within 1 hour and 20 minutes, Gary Gilmore's fate had finally been decided. This is Sandy Gilmour, Newswatch 2 in Denver.
Naturally, Utahns had widely varying reactions to Gary Gilmore and his fate, but as we sampled reaction, we found a common strain of people soberly, deeply moved by the day's events.
I was idealistic enough to hope that the gross travesties of injustice that we have seen throughout the Gilmour case would be stopped at some point, that somebody would be responsible enough somewhere along the line to stop this brutal and hideous act. I'm just appalled.
For some a victory, for others defeat. Probably none was more bitter or disgusted than members of the American Civil Liberties Union, who fought long and hard to prevent Gilmore's execution. But others feel the events before the execution tempered the American judicial system, like these Brigham Young University law students.
I'm surprised at Judge Ritter's actions, but the rest I think were all necessary, and I think that they're necessary safeguards, and I think that the court system worked rather well.
I thought the Supreme Court generally got involved more than it should have, and that the whole thing should have been carried out without that federal interference.
It's a very serious and solemn thing, and I'm in favor of the principle, but to see a man killed that you feel you got to know through the news, it affects you deeply.
Utah's governor said the Gilmour case had been tested to the limit. that in this case, all that was left was the execution itself.
I oppose capital punishment, except in rare cases where a heinous crime has been committed. And in that type of case, I believe that through the judicial system, a decision for capital punishment is justified.
Is Gary Gilmore one of those unique cases?
I believe that the Gilmour case would qualify within that limited category.
Regardless of what was or was not accomplished during the last few months, reverberations will be felt for a long time to come. Randy Ripplinger, Newswatch 2, reporting.
It's worth noting, we suppose, that however you judge the execution, it was a collective act, done by the people. It was done in your name. Incidentally, one news account tonight says Gilmour's body is to be cremated in the ashes spread by air over parts of Utah County. In Washington, meanwhile, the Supreme Court has delayed the execution of Texas killer Gary Jurek. He had been scheduled to die in the electric chair Wednesday. The delay will be at least 2 months.